Greetings, fellow adventurers. This is darkfireslide, and welcome to Pathfinder Kingmaker, where today I want to be talking about an interesting subject. I want to discuss the idea of the classic party and how it manifests itself into the game, both in Kingmaker itself and kind of Pathfinder in general, maybe even RPGs in general, just as a concept. And that is the idea of the classic party. So the classic party is kind of what was initially envisioned when D&D was kind of created. So the classic party specifically consists of, I believe in first edition Dungeons and Dragons, it was like the warrior, the cleric, the thief, might be the rogue still, and the wizard. And that hasn't changed much through pretty much all of the editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and Pathfinder, of course, being a offshoot of Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, follows suit, of course. So the question in this is, it depends how we want to look at this. So specifically, we're looking at is the classic party a capable party? So are they good at actually doing actually being effective in combat and other tasks, skill checks, things like that. Is the classic party a viable party for clearing beneath the stolen lands, which is kind of where we are right now? I've just completed my fourth run, um, although this one only went to floor 15, just because every time you clear a boss in this game, you essentially need to start a new run, since you can only kill one boss per run. I assume that's just a pacing thing, but anyway. And then we also want to ask, how flexible is this party setup? Is this a hyper specialized party, or what? And some of you may be thinking, well, if the classic party is only 4 people and you've got 5 people in your party, that must mean that it's not very good, right? Um, and the answer is it's complicated. So let's go over this party specifically and kind of talk about their strengths, weaknesses, etc., and stuff like that. So I've got Baladur here. He is a dwarven lawful good fighter. He uses the dwarven Urgrosh. He has a keen dwarven Urgrosh +2. For those who don't know, a dwarven Urgrosh is a double weapon, which means basically it has an axe head and a spear point, and you use it as if you were two-weapon fighting, but it's one weapon, so it's a double weapon in that regard. It's kind of like a double-bladed sword, just more dwarven. Um, and the thing is, this is what I would consider to be not a bad build, but not the kind of fighter maybe that was uh, envisioned, shall we say. So really what it comes down to in Pathfinder, I think, is this idea of like having a front line and then having characters behind that front line. And something that's really important for frontline characters is durability. Obviously, if you're in the very front and you get focused down by really hard hitting enemies, if you have no armor, if you don't have enough armor class, if you don't have enough hit points, you'll go down very very quickly indeed, and that will just kind of be the end for you. So the thing is that's nice about the fighter is just kind of you would think as just like the bog standard character for frontlining, and that isn't necessarily the case because the fighter is actually an extremely flexible class. You can build a fighter to be a two-weapon fighter. You can build a fighter to be an archer. You can build a fighter to be a two-handed fighter, and you can build him to be a sword and shield like melee character. You can build them to be focused around like tripping people and throwing sand in their faces. Whatever you want to do with physical fighting and combat, the fighter is capable of that. So the question then becomes, does that flexibility affect how the character actually functions in a party? And I think the answer has to do with more of how you plan on using that fighter. So in this scenario, in this party, I had a very specific reason for why I picked up another party member, and specifically why I picked up um, a paladin, basically, to go in the front line alongside my fighter. And this has more to do with my own mistake in party building than it does with how the fighter class actually functions. And it has everything to do with how the classic party was initially envisioned, I think, and how I built this party specifically. So Ideally, what you would have in the classic party is in the front, you've got your cleric, you've got your fighter, not in that order. Fighter would go first, and then you have the rogue who kind of tumbles in, uses acrobatics to get in behind the enemies and starts backstabbing them. So ideally, not being targeted, can leave combat at any time, etc. Um, the way I built this party is that the cleric is not a frontline fighter. He is a gnome, and he's a herald caller archetype. So he summons things. The problem, of course, is that if you don't summon things in time, then a single character in the front can tend to get overwhelmed pretty easily. Now that being said, he does have the nature domain, so he was able to get an animal companion later on. But initially, what I found is that I really just needed somebody else in front capable of taking damage. So ideally, you've got those three characters in the front and the wizard in the back with the regular kind of classic party setup. But the thing is, when we talk about this, the cleric itself is kind of an interesting class when it comes to whether or not you want a cleric to be in the front line. Because the thing about the cleric is he can wear up to heavy armor, which is good. Means he can get a lot of protection. He can cast a lot of protective spells, but he's also the party's primary healer and like debuff remover, basically in most cases. This means that if the cleric gets focused down by enemies, whether intentionally or not, if you make even one mistake with your cleric, um, and he dies, right, then the rest of the party generally follows suit because there will be no other way to kind of heal the party. Uh, Use a spell like Breath of Life to bring back a party member who just died, stuff like that. So having the cleric in the front line is contentious just because you really need to be careful, even though he is capable of wearing up to like heavy armor and stuff like that. Um, and then the other part of it that I varied when I played through this run is that this rogue here is, halfling rogue, is an archer, and that's specifically because in Kingmaker they made it so sneak attacks worked on enemies that are flanked. Period, regardless of whether or not you yourself are doing the flanking. So what this means is that if there are two frontliners up front and they are attacking the same target, and then the rogue shoots at that target, um, the rogue can essentially sneak attack with ranged weapons. And this is huge because then the rogue doesn't need to be in the front line. And the reason you don't want a rogue in the front line is because typically rogues have pitiful armor class. Even having a super high dexterity score, wearing good armor, good protective items, good spells, and everything like that, rogues tend to just not have very good armor class. As a as just kind of a thing, and like rogues can do a lot of damage up front if they're using like, for example, like two weapon fighting. But if they do that, then they're taking an attack penalty. And the other thing about rogues is they don't have the same base attack bonus as a fighter. So by being in the front line, the rogue is kind of at a disadvantage, just because their armor class can't be as high as like a fighter. So that puts them at a pretty big disadvantage. If you pick up shield proficiency for them, of course, and this is something I've never tried but always been interested in. If you have them wear like a light shield or even a heavy shield and use a weapon in one hand, that could help solve the durability issue that rogues tend to have. Um, Other than that, though, I mean, using them in the back is just so much more of a sensible solution to me than sending them in front, because when they're multi-shotting from the back and rapid shotting and stuff like that, you're doing more damage just because the penalties aren't as severe for using a bow that way compared to two weapon fighting, um, and power attacking and stuff like that. And because you get your full sneak attack when you're using ranged weapons, still, there's not really any penalty for it. So it keeps the rogue safe, keeps the rogue out of danger while still being able to use all of her abilities, which is really, really nice. But the thing is, well, let's talk about the wizard first, real quick. And the wizard is just kind of another. It's almost like a magical fighter in terms of like role, because the wizard can do pretty much anything. And I mean almost anything. Like, you can build a wizard to be just a backline caster who does a ton of damage. You can build a wizard to be a master crowd controller, a summoner who can fill a frontline with tons and tons of monsters, or even he can polymorph himself and become a frontline fighter himself, at least temporarily. So there's a lot of stuff that the wizard can do, and this kind of brings me to a point that I want to bring up is, with the exception of the rogue, all like the rest of the core classes of the classic party, so fighter, cleric, and wizard, are all generalists. They can do pretty much anything that they want to do, provided their character is built well and spec'd for whatever they want to do. In the case of the cleric, of course, it comes down more to just knowing the right spells to cast. For wizards, it's picking the right spells and feats, and for fighters, it's knowing which feats and building in a certain direction that's going to be conducive to using those. So the only specialized party member out of the entire group is kind of the rogue, and the reason the rogue is specialized is because they are a glass cannon class who do a lot of damage under specific circumstances, but are also very squishy. Um, does this mean rogues are bad? Absolutely not. Rogues do tons of damage in Kingmaker, and you shouldn't underestimate them for that. But as far as the core party goes, they are a very specialized class, whereas the rest of the classes are generalized. So they can do pretty much anything that they want to do with this class. Like, this same fighter can be built so many different ways, it's not even funny. And even the cleric, right? Even not even factoring in archetypes, there are just so many different ways that you can play the cleric based on feats, stat builds, whether or not you want him to be like a selective channeling, extra channeling, like mass healer, whether you want him to be like a specialized like debuff caster or buff caster for that matter. You're getting things like extend spell, spell focus, spell penetration. And the same thing goes for the wizard, picking spells that are going to be conducive to like crowd control versus ones that just buff the party, do damage, etc. And the nice thing is, in a lot of these cases, it's like, why choose? Why agonize over the decision when it's not a decision that you have to make in the first place, when you can use so many different options? This is as opposed to like a sorcerer, of course, who gets a much smaller selection of spells, but can cast them more per day, and that kind of makes sorcerers better for like damage dealing, but less good for like dealing with specialized problems. Because the wizard has, a pocket full of tricks that he can use for pretty much any situation whenever it calls for it. So let's get back to the original question. Does the classic party work? Well, I've made it to floor 15 and cleared the boss out of here. The party is currently 10th level, and we've made it through the dungeon. At the end, the fighter and the paladin both died. So the answer is yes. I think the classic party does work, and the reason for that is, but there's like a caveat, right? The classic party works if you build it to be a self-sufficient party. So, for example, for the cleric, you don't pick a wacky archetype like Herald Caller, and then the cleric can't be a frontline fighter. With the rogue, well, the rogue you still probably want to keep in the back line with a bow, just because you have the option to sneak attack that way. And then the wizard, if you want to build him as a frontline fighter, because the thing is, with the cleric and the fighter back to back, it still sometimes in the later game can feel like it's not enough to deal with the issues that come up later in the game. I know this is my fourth run. I can safely say that around like 14th, 15th level or so, like character level wise, the enemies get a lot tougher. It gets a lot harder to clear each floor, and clerics become more and more of a target in combat. So while the answer is a tentative yes, it comes down to whether or not you build the party in a certain way as to whether or not the classic party is going to work for you. So how would you make that work? Well, ideally you'd want the fighter to be a sword and shield fighter who focuses on defense a lot. The reason for this is because you really need someone in the front, if you've only got two people in the front, to be able to take damage, and specifically who can ignore damage through means of like really high AC. If he takes a prestige class like Stalwart Defender, he can also get things like damage reduction, which are really really good. And of course he'll be relying on buffs from the cleric and the wizard as well to kind of make him even more indestructible. But really you do just need some kind of to call into like tactics here, like some kind of anvil to kind of hold the line while the rest of your party does things that it needs to do. Because so many enemies in this game are extremely brutal, and if you don't have a character spec for defending against those characters, it can get messy really fast. Um, which is actually why I brought a paladin in this run, just because I realized after I made the party that, like, hey, only my fighter is actually in the front, and the summons from these two characters are not going to be enough to kind of cover his butt while he is fighting. So that's kind of where we're at on the classic party. Is you really have to know what you're doing and make sure that you have enough frontline staying power while also ensuring that you have enough damage in the back line. And if you do decide to use a rogue in melee instead of using a bow, you really just have to be careful and micromanage a lot. Um, which is really interactive and it's cool, but it's also a lot more work, and it can be very easy to make mistakes that can lead to the death of your party. So I think the classic party is a good baseline. It's really fun. I don't know if it's the best for this mode for Beneath the Stolen Lands, just because these characters are so generalized. Um, but overall, I think that they're still a good starting point for learning the core fundamentals of the game. I think that it's a good party setup to kind of learn the ins and outs of like how things like spellcasting work, to learn what a frontline fighter is supposed to do, what they can do, and just going through that is going to teach you a lot about the game and the core fundamentals. If you can clear at least up to this point using the core party, the classic party, then pretty much anything else that you use is going to be a reflection of your mastery of that skill, basically. Your understanding of how general classes can um, influence the game, and how picking a specialized class has trade-offs compared to using that. So, like a barbarian compared to a fighter, for example, would have a lot less AC, but a lot more damage. And so then you realize, like, well, my fighter was more durable. So if I'm using a barbarian in place of a fighter, then something else in my party needs to be making up that gap in defensiveness, in durability, just because the barbarian isn't going to be able to hold the line for as long, thanks to having a less defense usually. So just things to consider on that. I do think the classic party is a great starting point, but as you play, of course, you'll mold your play style to be whatever you want. And I mean, most people don't pick the classic party anyway. But for people who are newer to the game, if you do a fighter, rogue, cleric, and wizard, uh, that can be a really good starting point for you to kind of learn the fundamentals of like the way the game was intended to be played, technically. Although obviously there is no right way to play as long as you're having fun and you're succeeding. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little tidbit, just some of my thoughts on something that's kind of interesting. If you'd like to see more of these videos in the future, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.